And so I just want to tell you a little bit about the Wolfson Centre. For those of you who've not been part of our meetings before, I wanted to tell you a little bit about our centre and what kind of research that we do. So the Wolfson Centre for Personalised Medicine is housed at the University of Liverpool. We have a large dedicated team, bear with me. We have a large dedicated team of academics, nurses, administrators and laboratory staff who work together to conduct research to understand, predict and prevent adverse drug reactions. Professor Sir Mohammed, who a lot of you have met before, is the director of the centre, and the majority of the studies that we conduct at the centre are pharmacogenetic in nature. Now, some of you may have heard this term, pharmacogenetics or pharmacogenomics, but you're more likely to have heard the term personalised medicine. The three terms are often used interchangeably, but put quite simply, it is a field of medicine, field of research that studies how a person's genes affect how he or she responds to medications. And ultimately, with personalised medicine, we aim to tailor how we prescribe a drug to an individual based on their gene type. And this is really so that we can make sure that we prescribe the right drug to the right patient at the right dose to make sure we can maximise the benefit from the medicines and also minimise any harm to the patient. And so if you'd just like to move to the next slide, Nathan. So this slide is quite interesting, and it's able to illustrate the different responses from a group of patients who've been prescribed the same drug for the same diagnosis. As you can see, a medication can work really well for some patients, and it can treat the condition that we prescribe it for. And it's safe. For other patients, although the drug might be safe, it may not produce the desirable effect that we wish. So, for example, if we prescribe carbamazepine to a patient for epilepsy, it might not control the seizures. Unfortunately, for other patients, they may suffer an undesirable effect, and this can be in the form of an adverse drug reaction. Now, these reactions can range from being mild to moderate and sometimes can be severe. And so, why do we think this happens? Well, one of the reasons for this is that when a drug is first developed, the majority of early phase clinical trials that are conducted are on young, healthy male population. And we run these trials to be able to establish the safety of the drug and also establish how effective it is. So effectively, this then goes on to inform how we prescribe to the whole population. So it's as if we're prescribing for a one-dose-fits-all, as a one-dose-fits-all approach. However, there are many factors that can contribute to how a patient will respond to a medication. And for example, a person's age, their weight, their height, their ethnicity is a really important factor, whether they've got any underlying health problems. So for example, if they've got problems with their liver or their kidneys, and if they're taking lots of different medicines, these can all affect how a patient will respond to a medication. There's also increasing evidence to suggest that our genetic information, our DNA, can affect our response to medicines. And this is where personalised medicine fits in. And this is why what we do in our department is really important. If you could go to the next slide, please, Nathan. So just to highlight why research into adverse drug reactions is so important, as you can see on the slide here, adverse effects to drugs are quite a big problem for the NHS, and they cost quite a lot of money, costing approximately £1.6 billion annually. Now, Professor Mohammed, who we work for in our centre, and his colleagues were able to demonstrate through a study that they did that 6.5% of admissions to hospitals are caused by an adverse drug reaction. Now, I'd like to highlight here that the majority of adverse drug reactions that are happening, they fit into the mild to moderate category, and it's thankfully the more serious ones are more rare. And so I think it's important to highlight that this can place a huge burden on the National Health Service, but more importantly, and what we are very aware of is the effect that this can have on the quality of life of our patients. Our department is currently researching a range of different types of adverse drug reactions across many different clinical areas. For example, we are investigating toxicities which are associated with drugs called immunotherapy drugs for cancer. This is a fantastic set of medications, but they have the potential to treat patients and also extend life. But unfortunately, they come with side effects, and this is something that we're exploring at the moment. We also look at adverse drug reactions to statins, and we look at adverse drug reactions that are produced by some of the medicines that we use in mental health. However, in our department, we have a particular interest in serious skin reactions, such as Stevens-Johnson syndrome and toxic epidermal necrolysis. And one of my colleagues, who's a lecturer in the university, Dr. Dan Carr, is going to discuss the research that we do into SJS and 10 a little bit later. But I think it's also important, to highlight that we know that SJS is a potentially fatal reaction, commonly caused by medications. Can you just move on to the next slide for me, please, Nathan? We know that SJS is potentially fatal, and it's commonly caused by medications, but can also be caused by a viral infection. And that's really important to know, because when we assess a patient, we have to do a real thorough assessment to try to tease out whether the reaction has been caused by a drug or by a viral infection. So although any medication, including over-the-counter and herbal meds, can cause Stevens-Johnson syndrome, the more commonly implicated drug groups include those highlighted on the slide, which is non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, antibiotics, and anticonvulsants. We know that symptoms can present initially as non-specific, like fever, cough, headache, nausea and vomiting, but can very quickly progress to a blistering rash, which can predominantly affect the skin and mucous membranes. And depending on the severity of the reaction, we know that this can very quickly progress to a condition called toxic epidermal necrolysis. Can you move to the next slide, please, Nathan? And forgive me, I'm sure the majority of you here are aware of the classification that clinicians use for diagnosing SJS, but I thought this slide illustrates very clearly the progression across the spectrum from SJS to 10. I think we know that patients spend a long time in hospital once they've been diagnosed with SJS and 10. And we know that patients can experience a variety of symptoms. But one thing, unfortunately, that we do not understand is the variability in response and the unpredictability of the progression across this spectrum. And we also don't know why some patients will recover with no long-term complications, but others don't. Can you move to the next slide, please? Thank you, Nathan. So what are we doing as a centre to address this? Well, extensive research is being conducted to help us predict and prevent adverse drug reactions such as Stevens-Johnson syndrome and toxic epidermal necrolysis. And Dan will focus a little bit more about this later on. But I'd like to provide a couple of examples of how research in this field has been able to be translated into clinical practice to improve how we treat patients with medicines. And a perfect example is with a drug called abacavir. And this is a drug that's used in the treatment for HIV. This medication works extremely well for 90 to 95% of the population it is prescribed for, but a small percentage of patients, it caused a severe reaction called hypersensitivity syndrome. And following extensive research, which was replicated in many different countries, it was identified that patients with a particular gene who were prescribed abacavir were at a very high risk of developing hypersensitivity syndrome. And if we challenged with this drug, it could be fatal. And so consequently, the research was fantastic, and it led to a warning being placed on the packaging stating that patients should be genetically tested prior to being prescribed this drug, and that would prevent them having a severe reaction, which is wonderful. So similarly, just to give you another example, there was also a strong association between SJS which was induced by carbamazepine, as I mentioned before, a drug used for epilepsy, which was identified in the presence of another gene, but only in the Han Chinese population. And again, this highlights the importance of ethnicity as a factor that could contribute to a reaction to a medicine. And the research again led to a warning being placed on the packaging, instructing genetic testing prior to prescription. Can you just go to the next slide, please, Nathan? And so, although these are fantastic examples of how the research that we conduct on a daily basis can eventually be translated into care, into clinical care to improve how we treat patients with medicines, it's important that we continue to focus on the recruitment of patients who've experienced these really serious adverse drug reactions to help us better understand and improve how we treat our patients with any kind of medicine. And this slide gives us a little idea of how we do this in our centre. So we have a specialist team of lecturers, scientists, academics, nurses, administrators, laboratory staff, and we all work together to deliver the personalised medicine studies within the Wolfson Centre. And this is especially important when recruiting patients experiencing the more serious adverse drug reactions such as SJS and 10, as we have to collaborate on a national and international level to identify and recruit patients from many NHS trusts. Currently, at the moment, we are recruiting patients from approximately 150 NHS trusts across the country. And this requires a meticulous approach to study management and governance to ensure that our research is conducted to a very high standard in keeping with the relevant regulatory guidelines and approvals. Can you just go to the next slide, please, Nathan? And so, although we collaborate on many levels, professionally with professionals and different NHS trusts and internationally with people with research groups, we also, one of our more important collaborations is with our patient group. And this complements, collaborating with our patient group really complements the research activity of the centre. As I've mentioned earlier on in the presentation, we've worked closely with our patient group over the last 10 years. And one of the most fantastic initiatives that have developed from the group is the SJS awareness campaign. And as you can see from this slide here, it highlights some of the initiatives under the umbrella of the campaign. So bear with me for a second. So when we developed the group, it was really important that it took. Sorry, bear with me for a second. So the first time when we developed the group, the group came together, they very quickly recognised the importance of the research that we're doing as health professionals within our centre, but they highlighted that there was a gap in our service and that there was a real need to raise awareness of adverse drug reactions such as SJS and 10. It was highlighted that quite often SJS will be misdiagnosed and not detected early enough, and therefore a poster was designed by the group, and this was circulated via the National Institute for Health Research clinical research networks across the country, and this was in order to raise awareness of SJS and 10 amongst health professionals. This initiative also took us to the House of Commons and gave members of our group the opportunity to share their experiences and have a voice about the importance of education and training for health professionals. Can you just go to the next slide, please, Nathan? This is the poster that was designed by the group. It was well received by a lot of centres that we delivered it to, but one of the problems that we face with such an initiative is that we disseminate this across the country, but quite regularly these posters will be replaced by other important topics and other important posters. So I agreed an arrangement with the clinical research networks that this poster would be disseminated twice yearly to try and sustain the momentum of raising awareness about the research that we do and SJS awareness in particular. So the group have also being members of our group, the members of our group have also been fantastic in supporting and facilitating recruitment to our research studies. And information about our research is now advertised via the SJS Awareness UK website. People have the opportunity now to contact us directly if they're interested in participating in research, which is really wonderful, because sometimes as health professionals, we struggle to identify patients who've suffered with these serious reactions across the country. So the more people are aware of the research that we're doing in the department and they are able to self-refer, this is wonderful, and we can help them facilitate it locally for them. Would you like to go to the next slide, please, Nathan? So members of our patient and public involvement group have also had the opportunity to get involved in a number of awareness initiatives over the years, such as International Clinical Trials Day, International Nurses Day, and also yellow card awareness initiatives to raise awareness again of adverse drug reactions and the importance of reporting, which is fantastic. Go to the next slide, please, Nathan. I'm not going to talk too much about yellow card reporting. I think I'll just leave this because Christine's going to talk to us about this in detail. So if you could just go on to the next slide, please, Nathan. Another exciting initiative that has been developed by the patient group is the Mysjs Passport. Now, this booklet was designed to encourage a multidisciplinary team approach to care post-diagnosis. Members highlighted that they often had to explain themselves time and time again to different healthcare professionals, for example, their dermatologist, their ophthalmologist, their optician, their GP, and so they were forever having to explain what they've been through and take lots of information to the appointments with them. So the members of the group thought that that having such a lovely little booklet which was a summary of all of the important information gathered together would be a really fantastic tool to take with them to appointments. Now, it took us a little bit of time to get this booklet into its current form. And a number of years ago, once it was produced and published, a number of years ago, SJS Awareness UK did a sterling job in trying to disseminate this passport to patients, to health professionals in clinics in Barking and surrounding areas. And the passport information was also detailed on the charity website, so people could request a copy via the website. And this was fantastic. You know, this went on and there was a lot of hard work that was hard work by the charity to enable this to happen. But Nadia and I discussed at length how best to monitor the use of the passport. And we wanted to know who was using it, where they were using it, if it was actually useful for people to use. We realised that the information that we could collect would be extremely valuable if we wanted the passport to be accepted and utilised effectively in the NHS and by patients, but we just didn't have the resource to do this. Would you like to go to the next slide, please, Nathan? And so following discussions with Professor Pir Mohammed, it was decided that the passport could be evaluated as part of a programme of work as part of my PhD. And the programme of work is to identify strategies to improve the detection and reporting of adverse drug reactions. So the evaluation of the passport fitted in really, really well here. Go to the next slide, please, Nathan. My PhD is looking at a number of projects really to try to help us identify and report, to improve how we can identify and report adverse and drug reactions. But I'm just going to talk a little bit more about the passport evaluation. So if you'd like to go to the next slide, please, Nathan. So we decided that if we were to include this officially or systematically evaluate the SJS Passport, the aim of the project would be to evaluate participants and or carers' perceptions of the passport after using it for 6 months. We asked participants to use the passport for a 6-month period and take it to all of their appointments with them. And what the objectives of the project is to evaluate the usability and acceptability of the passport, to explore if the passport is useful for clinicians, to inform if there needs to be any changes to the passport if it's to be accepted in practice, and also to obtain evidence to support or refute the consideration for a wider implementation in an NHS setting. And so it was really unfortunate because the project started 3 months before the pandemic. So patients were recruited onto this study, they were given the passport, they were asked to utilise it for a 6-month period, but 3 months into using it, all appointments were stopped and we went into lockdown, and unfortunately patients weren't attending as many appointments. But despite this, following discussions with Prof, we thought it was still a really feasible project as a proof of concept study. And so what we thought was we'd continue with the study, we'd continue to gather the information, and we'd have a look at the data that was produced by the evaluation. Now, I haven't analysed all the data from this project yet. The project is finished and all the data has been gathered, but I haven't had a chance to analyse the data. But just taking a preliminary look at the information that I've gathered together, and there is some fantastic benefits that have come out of the passport. Patients highlighted that this is a really fantastic tool. It's a great summary of important information that they can take along with them to appointments and any admissions that they're having. This was a really, really fantastic finding, that participants thought that the booklet was used to validate, it was useful to validate their diagnosis. And this was not just with health professionals, but with their family and with work, which I thought was a really, really interesting finding. Other participants thought that it was useful when they were using the assessment, when they were doing their PIP assessment. And I think the PIP assessment is for when they're applying for benefits if they can't work. So the validation of their diagnosis and their long-term complications associated with the condition was really useful in this situation. Another really important finding, which was a benefit to the passport, was that participants felt that the transition from child services to adult services, to take the passport with them, and especially during the pandemic, and for a child who's going into adult service to hand that passport over to their health professional to give them a nice little summary of what they've experienced with SJS, was a wonderful, wonderful thing. And so finally, I think that most of the participants thought that this would be a really, really useful tool. They recognise that there are some changes required for the passport to be used to the best of its advantage, and this is something that we're going to work on in the near future. I'm going to write up the findings from this passport, and then hopefully we'll be able to adapt it again. And what I would like to do is use the information gathered from this project to be able to apply for funding to be able to implement the passport as a wider implementation in an NHS setting. And so this is something that hopefully I'll be able to report more deeply on in the new year when I write up the findings from the project. And so I'd really just like to finish here, because the point of my presentation today was just to give everybody who hasn't been to the meeting before just a snapshot really of the kind of research that goes on in our department, how important the research is and how it can actually help patients and improve how we prescribe medicines to patients. But importantly is to highlight the benefits of having a strong collaboration and partnership with our patient group. Because if it wasn't for our patient group, there's certain topics that we would never have identified as researchers. And I think, we hope that this relationship goes on for a long, long time with our patient group. And for those of you who've not been involved before and would like to get involved in future meetings, please get in touch with either myself or Nathan or Nadia at the end of the meeting, and we'll put you on our mailing list, and hopefully you'll be able to join us again in the future.